Leon looked a little pale in the flickering light. Almost dead. I said his name once and then repeated it. No response. You still alive, Mr. Leon? I asked. I shook him.
Still here, Doc.
He whispered.
Just waiting to get some sleep.
When Leon spoke, he didn't seem to move his lips hardly at all. Or maybe he did. Perhaps it was just the dimly lit room that made it seem so. You and me both, I suggested. Then I studied Leon's slender frame for a moment. His dark skin was paper thin and wrinkled. After seeing the faint rise and fall of his chest wall, I allowed myself to breathe a little easier. Shall I tell you the story of the patient who wouldn't stop smoking? I asked as I began my exam. Leon had been my patient for as long as I'd been in training. We knew each other through and through, so I already knew what his response would be.
Not really.
A story then, I replied, cutting him off. I'll make it a good one. Once upon a time, a man was given a chance to live his life. All he had to do was stop smoking. I started to say, just as I began auscultating his lungs. But the man refused, and inevitably, he wound up in the hospital.
What kind of story is that?
He asked, sounding annoyed. I conveyed a light-hearted scowl. Shush! I'm not done. Now, in the hospital, this man got better, and soon, he became healthy enough to be discharged home. However, he still needed to stop smoking. If he didn't, he'd end up back in the hospital, or worse. I then finished my exam and glanced down at the hospital bed. Do you know how this story ends, Mr. Leon?
I have no idea, Doc.
He declared as he rolled over in bed, effectively ending the conversation. I sighed, as Mr. Leon was one of my favorite patients, but I could only do so much. Neither do I replied as I exited the room.
Attention, attention!
Blasted a mechanical voice from the hospital's intercom.
Please keep your mask on at all times.
It replayed every hour or so, reminding us of our responsibilities during the current pandemic. As I walked down the hallway, I passed Dr. Shelley Silverstein, my chief resident. She stopped me and asked for a favor.
Can you cover my shift this evening? My fiance and I need to go grocery shopping before the stores become overrun.
I didn't hesitate. Of course, I eagerly replied. I felt Shelley smile underneath her N95 mask as she continued her trek down the hall. I ducked inside the physician's lounge, heading to the restroom I knew was there. En route, I passed our bulletin board. Flyers from a colleague's self-made real estate business occupied every square inch. Let us guide you home was the company's slogan, its words plastered across the entire board. The bulletin board made me think about my decision to cover Shelley's shift. I had already made plans to go back home to visit my folks that evening, and they were expecting me. I'd also been working 72 straight hours and was incredibly exhausted. I walked into the restroom and stopped in front of the mirror. It's only an afternoon shift, I assured the woman staring back at me. You'll still have time to go back to your apartment tonight, sleep, and head home in the morning. Just then, as I spoke, there was a second where the person in the mirror looked almost unfamiliar. For the briefest of moments, it felt like my brain couldn't recognize my reflection. Later that afternoon, I'd started rounding with Dr. Rabin, one of our attendings. He's an older doc who'd been at the hospital since its conception. As we moved through the patient list, we finally arrived at Leon's room. We opened the door and found him sitting upright in his bed.
You look great,
Dr. Rabin stated as he examined Leon. I wearily nodded in agreement. He appeared to have more energy compared to earlier that day. Almost seemed to have more energy than me at that moment.
Luckily, I had a good doctor,
Leon replied, giving me a wink. His compliment made me smile under my N95.
Oh, you can't mean this young lady here.
Said Dr. Rabin, jokingly, in my direction.
Just kidding. Dr. Dunbar is one of the good ones. Well spoken too.
Leon frowned, then turned to me and gave me a confused look.
Please keep your mask on at all times,
repeated the hospital's intercom. I forced myself to keep smiling. Dr. Rabin finished up his exam and moved on to the next patient room. I stayed behind to help Leon lay back in bed. That's when I noticed the pink wristbands. At first, they looked like one of those "What would Jesus do" bracelets. Then I realized the letters inscribed on them made up completely different acronyms. Left hand, YWTM. Right hand, DLIWY. "Those are cute," I said, taking a moment to admire them once he'd gotten settled. I figured he'd just put them on since I didn't remember seeing them earlier in his hospitalization. "What do the letters stand for?" He didn't respond. After a few seconds, I looked up and saw the confusion written on his face. He gently grasped my left wrist and held it to the right. Then, I nearly shat my pants. On my left wrist was the same bracelet, with the same YWTM acronym. I unconsciously took a step backward, staring at my wrist in disbelief. "How'd you do that?" Leon looked just as perplexed as I was, but for different reasons. He also seemed genuinely concerned.
You don't remember?
He asked, almost desperately.
Where is your other bracelet?
Suddenly, I heard a ringing to my immediate left. I jumped, but then turned and saw that it was just the hospital's in-room phone. Each patient room gets one, and the hospital gives the contact information to close friends and family. But I've known Leon for years, and he had neither. "Aren't you going to answer?" I asked. Then, with a solemn expression, he replied,
They're not calling for me.
I frowned, secretly terrified. I stared back at Leon and silently hoped that this was all just a joke. If it was, the punchline never came. Leon then rolled over, once again putting an end to our dialogue. Great, I thought. After a few moments of just watching the phone ring, I finally built up the nerve to pick up the receiver. At first, there was nothing but static. I said, "Hello?" many times before an intelligible voice began to bleed through. 5 syllables repeated over and over. The words were too distorted and sounded as if someone was screaming them from somewhere far away. Then all of a sudden, the voice screeched at full volume, hammering its message into my brain.
Let us guide you home.
Shit! I shrieked and immediately dropped the receiver.
Dr. Dunbar.
This time, the voice came from behind me. I turned and saw it was just Dr. Rabin.
Let's go see these last few patients.
He instructed and disappeared back into the hallway. I turned back towards the phone. The receiver was back on the hook. Then I cautiously picked it back up and placed it to my ear. Nothing but a dial tone. I looked up at Leon, who was snoring. I stood in the middle of Leon's room for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened, or maybe what didn't happen. I mean, I was exhausted, could barely keep my eyes open. Maybe I just hallucinated, I thought, and my mind tried to convince me of this desperately. Still, a part of me refused to believe. I'd guess the pink bracelet still on my left wrist is what prevented me from buying into the lie completely. I finally gained my composure and turned to exit Leon's room. But before I did, I heard a high-pitched wheezing. It took me a moment to realize it was just Leon laughing. I caught back up with Dr. Rabin, and we finished our rounding. I was starting to prepare to go home, finally, when I received an urgent page from the hospital, instructing us to log onto a hospital-wide WebEx call. So, I found a quiet spot in the lounge and booted up my laptop.
"You must keep your mask on at all times,"
said a small version of the hospital's CEO on my laptop screen. The pandemic was in its beginning stages, and the purpose of the call was to help the hospital get its shit together. The tiny CEO continued.
"The influx of patients is ramming up in the ED, and we need some of you to extend your shifts into overnight, maybe even to the morning hours to help cover the patient load. Unfortunately, we can't guarantee overtime pay. Any volunteers?"
The conference call went silent.
"How about some of the residents? It's a good way to stack your resume. Get some experience."
I glanced at the small faces of my cohort at the bottom of the screen. None seemed to be jumping at the opportunity. Then, out of nowhere, I received a text from my dad. It said my mom had developed a bad cough and that he thinks it's the flu. I started to text back and say that I'll be there tonight and that I'd check her out then. But then, the call became even more silent than it already was. And then, I suddenly got the feeling that someone was watching me. I looked back up at my laptop screen, and what I saw sent chills down my spine. Every face was glaring straight into their camera, making it appear like everyone on the call was staring directly at me. After the initial shock passed, I found myself staring back at their wide, judgmental eyes and thinking, maybe. My mind slowly succumbed to an unseen force, and I felt myself stretch thinner and thinner. Eventually, I found myself questioning my level of exhaustion. Well, was I even all that tired? Maybe I was just lazy. Whatever it was, I had to push through. The hospital, these patients, needed me. I volunteer as tribute, I replied, a tired eagerness in my voice. Everyone on the call immediately started laughing. My word choice was a Hunger Game reference. I even chuckled a little as I exited my dad's text and put away my phone.
Dr. Dunbar?
Inquired someone on the call in a warped voice. They said something else, but I couldn't quite make it out as there was too much laughter. Can you speak up? I asserted. I searched through the faces on the screen, but none seemed to be talking. Every face just continued to giggle uncontrollably. It wasn't that good of a joke, I thought. I looked and looked, but nothing. I then felt my mouth become dry, and for some reason, I became nervous. Then, the voice repeated itself, louder and clearer this time.
Let us guide you home.
I closed my eyes and shook my head as I mumbled, "No," under my breath. I'd almost forgotten about this cursed voice and its message. It continued to repeat itself.
Let us guide you home. Let us guide you home. Let us guide you home. Let us...
Stop it! I found myself shouting at the laptop screen like a crazy person.
Are you okay?
Asked a different voice on call, one I knew belonged to Shelley. I rubbed my eyes and reassessed the screen. The laughter on the call was gone. Every face regarded me with a more professional, non-giggling manner. I swallowed hard, cleared my throat, and replied to my chief's inquiry. Of course, I stated as I felt a mutated smile manifest under my N95 mask. I felt her force a similar one underneath her own. That night, the administration placed me in the emergency department. The whole unit was in complete disarray, with hundreds of patients trickling in non-stop. I learned my role quickly and joined in the chaos. Running on fumes, I evaluated my first patient, who I'll henceforth refer to by her initials, BW. BW was a sweet old lady who held a striking resemblance to my mother. She'd come into the ED with chest pain and was noticeably in distress. EKG was negative, but given her presentation, I was concerned that she could have been having some underlying coronary artery disease, aka a heart attack. I initiated further work up until...
It's just reflux,
said someone behind me. I turned around and saw Dr. Rabin, canceling my lab orders. But, I tried to say before he cut me off. I then felt a vague sense of exigency ping inside my chest.
Give her a GI cocktail and send her home.
I frowned.
Please keep your mask on at all times,
muttered the mechanical voice over the intercom. Of course, I replied, ignoring the ping. I then gave BW the cocktail, instructed her to take Nexium, and sent her on her way. She thanked me as she walked out the door. I worked that shift into the morning hours. I remember taking a short coffee break and then returning to the unit and hearing a code red blast over the intercom. I turned the corner and saw BW back in the ED on the floor, gripping her chest. Adrenaline exploded through my veins as I dropped my coffee and ran to her side. We hooked her up to a cardiac monitor, which showed her in asticely. We'd gotten to her too late. BW was dead, approximately 10 hours after she'd first arrived in the ED.
Clean up on Alfrey.
I tracked the voice back to Dr. Rabin, and I witnessed he and a few nurses erupt in malicious laughter. It took me a second to realize that the punchline was not referring to the spilled coffee. My face contorted in disgust at the extremely insensitive and distasteful joke. I opened my mouth, ready to give the older doc a massive piece of my mind.
Please keep your mask on at all times.
The words caught in my throat. My stomach turned inside my abdomen as my eyes scanned the rest of the ED. What I saw next quickly hushed me into silence. For the first time, an intense terror took hold of me in a way I didn't think was possible. All the movement in the ED had ceased. Gurneys stopped rolling to the OR, nurses stopped administering medicine, and even the patients themselves came to a standstill. Every gaze became transfixed on my position, and every mouth in the vicinity stretched past the lateral boundaries of their overlying N95 masks, revealing the outer edges of a broad and threatening grin. I stumbled to my feet, slowly combing the enraged crowd. I didn't realize I'd been slowly backing up until I felt a cold hand on my shoulder halt my backward progress. I turned and saw Dr. Rabin's face. At first, he appeared calm and indifferent, as always. But then, in an instant, his face turned fire hydrant red and his eyes bulged in rage from above his mask. Then, at a high-pitched, ear-splitting volume, he asked,
"Don't you think I'm fucking hilarious?"
At that moment, absolute terror filled my every pore. I felt like an animal trapped in a cage, and I suddenly became terrifyingly uncomfortable in my own skin. I then sensed a familiar bubbling sensation in the back of my throat. I tried to shut my mouth closed, but was unable to do so in time. I then felt those 2 fucking syllables escape past my lips. Of course. Then, the whole emergency department breathed a sigh of relief, almost as if it was a single organism. And, somewhere deep inside of me, I felt something crack. As I helped prepare BW's body for the morgue, I simultaneously received a text from my father and a page from Labor and Delivery. I returned the latter. It was an on-call OBGYN result. She was in the middle of a complicated delivery and needed an extra pair of hands. Stat. Her voice sounded urgent. I was happy to be parting from the ED, but as I made it to the doors, shame forced me to glance back at BW's corpse one last time. And in that split second, just before the door shut, my eyes took note of something pink dangling from her wrists. As I ran upstairs to L&D, I glanced back down at the pink bracelet still located on my wrist. When I did, I noticed the letters had faded a bit. I got upstairs and saw half the staff running in and out of a specific room off the right. Then, a gurney came rushing out of the room, made a left, and headed right for me.
Delivery was too complicated,
Shouted the OBGYN resident from behind the gurney. I jumped out of the way and followed behind.
We're transitioning to C-section. Go scrub in.
I nodded and left for the sinks. But as I was gloving up, the staff nurse in charge of PPE made me remove my pink bracelet. There was no way around it. I had to oblige. 2 hours into the surgery, my phone continued to vibrate over and over again.
Dr. Dunbar,
declared the OBGYN resident, just as I glanced down at my pocket. I looked back up and saw her eyes chastising me. I pulled myself back into the moment.
Oh, I can't wait to hold him,
said the mom. The sweat on her bronzed forehead almost sparkled under the OR's incandescent light.
I can't wait until you guys finish delivering him.
But we were finished. We had already delivered her beautiful baby boy just minutes before. She didn't know this because the baby never started crying. Upon delivery, we immediately stopped working on her and had to start working on him. And no one in the OR had the gall to notify her of this fact.
He's gonna be a doctor one day,
the mother declared.
I can just feel it.
Please keep your mask on at all times,
said the intercom. and I would have sworn I heard a trace of sadness in its mechanical voice. The baby's tan complexion became paler and paler, and his lips were blue and lifeless. I looked up at the OBGYN resident, and she gave me a grave nod. My body then started to move on its own. The OBGYN resident walked to the mom's bedside to deliver the bad news. As she did this, I found myself grabbing a small surgical mask from a nearby drawer. I made my way back to the neonate, just as cries exploded from the mother. It sounded like an animal had died in the OR suite. I tried my best to ignore the screams, but they sunk deep into my skin, down past my bone. And once they hit my soul, I felt another crack. I reached for the stillborn and placed the small fabric over his mouth and wrapped the small strings around his tiny pale ears. "Please keep your mask on at all times," I whispered. I dragged my feet out of the surgical suite. Some of the nurses went out for a smoke break and had invited me to come along. I politely refused, explaining that I don't smoke. My forehead then ceased in intense concentration, as I felt I'd just forgotten something truly important. My father's text messages.
Hey, Dr. Dunbar.
Said a voice down the hallway. It belonged to my chief resident, Dr. Shelley Silverstein.
Everything okay?
I ignored her. My focus was on my phone. I opened it and found dozens of texts and missed calls. "We had to rush your mother to the hospital. They just rolled her into ICU. She's not doing well. Noelle, please, answer your damn phone." And then, I saw another text. His last text. It was timed several hours from the previous ones. It was after this text that all other communication stopped. I saw the beginning of the text message on the preview. It was a familiar phrase, one I hadn't heard since WebEx call. And when I noticed it, my entire body went numb.
Let us guide you home.
I immediately turned off my phone and placed it back into my pocket. I didn't know what the rest of the message after the first sentence was, but I didn't want to know.
Noelle?
I heard Shell's voice inquire a second time, and I knew then what needed to happen. "Hey, Shell?" I asked as I looked up at her. My eyes were bloodshot and void of emotion. My voice, surprisingly calm and collected. "I have to go home for a few days. My mom's in the hospital. You mind covering my shift?" She paused for an unholy amount of time before responding.
"I'm so sorry, but I can't,"
she replied as I stared at her packing up her things. It was the middle of Saturday morning, yet she was going home? She saw me staring and casually responded.
"Oh, I had already planned to go to the beach with my fiancé,"
she said with a smile.
"You understand, right?"
I didn't hesitate. Of course. As she walked out of the hospital, felt myself let go. Then there was a loud bang, and I found myself staring at the ceiling. I'd collapsed, fainted. But as the world faded to black, I surprisingly felt myself feeling more and more at peace. This is what I needed, I thought to myself as the darkness approached. I just needed some rest. After I wake up, I'm going to rush to my parents' bedside, but not before breaking my foot off in both Shell and Raven's asses. I felt a genuine smile manifest on my face as I dwindled, probably the first real smile in the past 96 hours. And the last thought to cross my mind before I disappeared into the blackness were the mechanical words of the hospital intercom.
Please keep your mask on at all times.
Then I awoke. I was inside a familiar, dimly lit room, lying on my back, facing the ceiling.
Hello.
I nearly jumped out of my skin when I realized someone was in the room with me. I looked to the side, and there I saw Leon, standing over me, and he appeared healthier than ever. "Where the hell did you come from?" I asked. Or at least, I thought I asked. I couldn't tell if my lips moved or not. Then I tried to sit up, but found that I couldn't. I then felt a heavy dread beginning to pool inside my stomach. "What the?" I screamed inside my head. "What the hell is this? What's wrong with me?" My lips refused to move. Leon ran his tongue over his teeth, and suddenly, I was afraid. He stayed looming over me for a moment, but then shuffled over to the nearby recliner.
You still alive, Doc?
He asked sarcastically. He then began twirling the pink bracelet on his left wrist.
It stands for You Wear the Mask, by the way. You'd asked me that earlier, remember? The phrase refers to a charge placed on you and me and other beings like us. It was a pact our ancestors made to help us blend in and to survive in this new world. A silent contract agreed too long before either of us were born. It comes at a price, however.
His eyes then met my paralyzed glare. He looked disappointed, almost sad.
If we wear them for too long,
He continued after clearing his throat.
we risk forgetting who we are underneath.
A chill ran through my veins, the sensation feeling vaguely familiar. Leon then shifted his focus to the bracelet dangling from his right wrist.
But this one keeps us safe, balanced, reminds us never to let the mask we wear us.
I didn't know what he was saying. None of it made any sense. But when I looked upon him now, I didn't see the same Leon. I didn't see an older man with crippling nicotine addiction. I saw a scarred, tormented being with wounds so deep that appeared to exist past his DNA, past his physical body, and seemed to penetrate time itself. And then, the being stood from his recliner, took a deep breath, opened his mouth wide, and smiled.
Shall I tell you a story of the doctor who couldn't stop giving?
No, I thought.
It's a story about how she gave and gave until she only had one thing left to give.
No, I begged inside my mind. Please.
A story, then.
I'll make it a good one.
I walked out of the front of the hospital, and I heard the sounds of a cardiac monitor going off as the front doors closed shut behind me. I rubbed the tender knot on the back of my head. As I did, I admired the new pink bracelet dangling from my wrist.
Hey, Noel.
Yelled a voice from the side of me. I turned and saw a familiar African-American nurse taking her smoke break. I walked over to where she stood.
Heard you had a tumble. You okay?
I smiled as I removed my N95 mask. I then bummed a cigarette from the nurse, lit the end, and deeply inhaled. After exhaling, I turned back and replied, "Of course."